Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Sally Dunsmore and I'm the director of the FT Weekend Oxford Literary Festival. As you know, there was once a time I grew up in, without the World Wide Web, Twitter, Facebook, mobile phones, and the marvellous opportunities for learning afforded by the development of this new technology. But as with much that is pioneering, there is often a downside. I am not sure when I was young I would have coped well with the pressures of social media. The responsibilities for training and guiding our young people in this new era are enormous, a great challenge for all leaders in education. I couldn't have known that a chance meeting with Simon Walker, co-founder of Steer at Christchurch 10 years ago, would bring this important day to the festival. Technology is racing at such a pace it is hard to keep up. The pressures on the young looking to their futures must be enormous, while at the same time thrilling. The capacity for learning and finding out about stuff is exciting. And we, the festival, are privileged to host it. We hope this will form a series of annual sessions at the festival. I warmly welcome you to Oxford, and I would like to thank Simon Walker and his team at Steer for creating this special day, and speakers Professor John Barr and Professor Stephen Roberts. I believe you'll have a fascinating and truly enlightening session. Thank you.
Thank you, Sally. My name is Simon Walker, and I am the co-founder of Steer, and it is a huge privilege for us to have been asked to organise and design this day today. I was honoured to launch two of my books here at the festival 9 years ago, and now to be leading this day with speakers of global calibre. Experts and leaders in their field, in their research fields, both in AI and in the unconscious mind. There's going to be a quality and a precision and an insight which I know that we will all enjoy and benefit from. So it's a very exciting day that we have ahead of us. I guess we've all come with questions that we're interested in thinking about today, and this is certainly going to be one of them. What kinds of problems will machines help us to address? What kind of human thinking can be replaced by machines, and indeed what kind cannot? Perhaps almost a more important question. And are there unintended risks for us as a species in relying on AI? I'm sure you've had those questions buzzing around your head, and over the course of the day we're going to be looking at those, and we're going to be looking at this not from the perspective of the end user who's actually using technology principally and the kinds of technologies that are out there, but from the first principles of how the mind works and how the mind is affected by technology, and then how the mind can collaborate and contribute unique human capacities alongside it. The shape of the day is that in the morning we'll be thinking about the impacts of technology on the human mind, and then in the afternoon the uniqueness of the human mind compared to the machine mind. Now, one of the things that I do is that I play the role of a reviewer for UNESCO on their policies in AI and education. And 2 weeks ago I was in Paris at the global headquarters participating in a conference of educational leaders from around the world, and they were considering the contribution that AI is making and can make to education. Now, one of the things that was very apparent in that setting was a shared optimism that AI is going to address many of the problems that are facing the world from an education perspective. And principally, they were interested and excited about access. They were excited about the ability of technology to distribute knowledge and open doorways to those who couldn't otherwise access education in disadvantaged or developing countries. They were fascinated and optimistic about the ability of AI to, for example, take on some of the load in autonomous marking and therefore reduce the requirement for teachers. They were excited about the potential of AI to personalise curricula and therefore to be able to direct children to learning which they felt they needed at the right time. And so there was a sense of optimism, even evangelism in Paris, about the possibility of AI for education. But I think one of the important things as educators is that we look at education not just from the perspective of its economic access benefits, but a more fundamental question about whether the education that we are providing for the next generation is going to enable them to become more fully human. And by contrast, whether there are any unintended risks associated with our education in them becoming less human as a result of it. Now, technology always gives us a sense of potential to solve problems. And there is something in the human spirit that is deeply attracted to having the load, the effortful things in life, supported and carried by some kind of machinery. And I think there's been a desire to look at technology to support the cognitive work that we have to do as human beings. If you like, the internet is an exercise in cognitive outsourcing, where we hand over the task of memorizing large amounts of data to an external memory, which we can then rely on, rather than having to internalize memory ourselves. Now, this is a hugely attractive proposition, but it comes with potential consequences. There's an interesting series of studies which demonstrated that when you had two groups of people asked to do the same difficult task, which they had to learn how to do, one of whom were given paper-based instructions and the other were given online Google-based instructions, neither of the groups were any better at actually learning that skill, but the Google group thought their skills were better. They rated their skills more highly. And that's an interesting conclusion, that the sense of having access to an external memory, we tend to confuse with our own internalized learning of that data. And there are a growing number of studies which are showing internalizing data, learning knowledge, is critical for higher level thinking and concept formation. So if we think that we can outsource this memory and no longer need to learn things in the classroom, then we're going down a very dangerous and unjustified path. One of the great appeals of technology is this sense that we can bend the road of the world so that the road we individually walk on is more personalized to ourselves. We love the thought that we could have a curriculum fed to us that is tailored to our needs, to our questions. And we think that this is going to improve education and mean that children don't sit through lessons that aren't targeted at them. But we should take note of the previous experiments to personalise curricula. Those of us who are head teachers or educators for any length of time will remember perfectly well the optimism around VAK, visual, audio, and kinesthetic learning, which promised to personalise learning to the learning style of the learner and proved, while seductive, to be utterly fallacious. There were no benefits, accelerated learning outcomes associated with this whatsoever. And the bottom line is that learning is hard. It is hard to internalise knowledge, and it is hard to apply it and use it accurately. And outsourcing cognitive load risks weakening our ability to perform that task and therefore lowering the learning we gain as a result of it. We should learn from the profound, long-standing work of John Hattie, who's demonstrated that over 30 years of research shows that learning about learning, being aware of yourself as a learner and being resourceful is the critical accelerator for us as learning. And technology will not take that away. Now, technological utopianism is an old idea. Thomas More wrote his book centuries ago, Utopia, and since then human beings have been looking for ways to solve the problems of the world. And there is at the moment a kind of technological utopianism surrounding some of the digital pioneers and entrepreneurs. There was this great sense that if we could only put knowledge online, we could democratize knowledge, and human beings and societies would start to make better decisions because we are better informed. What's surprised us, and indeed has confused the liberal elite around the world, is that this hasn't happened. That despite better access to knowledge, more information, educated societies are arguably making worse. Bear in mind the last 2 to 3 years of political decisions that this country and the US have made, worse political decisions than their forebears. Now, this confusion, this unexpected outcome, arises because of a false model of the mind which we've held on to in the West since the Enlightenment. And the model is this, that the mind is essentially rational. The mind makes right choices, and its only limitation is the access it has to knowledge. So if we feed it the right knowledge, the human mind will come to the right conclusions. And that was the ideology which underpinned the digital optimism of outsourcing knowledge to the internet. We would educate and therefore politically democratize the world through this mechanism. But the mind, in fact, does not work like that. And what we've been discovering over the last 20 to 30 years is that the mind is not the autonomous, individualized, rational mind of Descartes. I think, therefore I am. It's not the mind of the individual who distills and looks objectively at the world and comes to logical conclusions. That the mind, in fact, is not singular at all, it is plural. That your mind is a collection of minds. It participates in the minds of the society of others around it and is influenced by those minds in ways that we are both aware and indeed unaware. And indeed, the mind is ecological in the sense that it's not boundaried by our skull, but is permeable to the behaviours and choices of others around it. The thinking of other people directly influences my own thinking. And indeed, not only is my thinking influenced by other people's thinking, it is biased by it as well. So that rather than following a straight path, I will unconsciously follow distortions, misorientations, influenced by my own prior thinking or the thinking of the group around me. Daniel Kahneman, whose works he summarized in his book Thinking Fast and Slow, was one of the pioneers who worked in this field. But I'm really delighted to say that we have with us today Professor John Barr, who's spent his lifetime researching the social mind and the permeability of the mind to the environment around it. And we're going to learn astonishing things a little bit later on. Now, in my organisation, STEER, we directly measure the biases that children are developing in their minds, in their patterns of thinking. And we've empirically established that over their adolescence, children can establish patterns of what we call fixed biases, iterated patterns of thinking, which they are less able to adjust as they move from situation to situation. We've established that children can also develop patterns of what we call over-regulating, where they're so conscious of the ecological environment, they're so conscious of the road that they're driving on, that they deploy so much mental energy in monitoring that and reacting to it that they become exhausted. And as a result of that exhaustion, they become depleted and they develop higher risks of unhealthy patterns of mental and social behaviour. And we've developed data which has shown consistently that children can be dysregulated, both by events that happen in their lives, but also by context that they participate in. And indeed, we've been sharing with our head teachers for the last 5 years that school is a context which can both regulate or dysregulate the minds of young people. And of course, the conclusion that we need to come to is that the internet is the largest ever global priming system that has ever been built. And that's the singular way that we need to understand it, as a priming engine, whose effects are constant, 24/7 and global, and are having an orientation and a biasing effect on every single person who is participating online around the world. Now, the next conclusion we need to accept is a social one, that social media and the tech giants who drive much of the internet space and landscape we operate on want to move this diverse, heterogeneous communities of people to this. And they want to do that because if they can aggregate people with like-minded cognitive biases, then they can sell them things. And if they can sell them things, ideas or products, they can sell advertising. So social media companies are designed to be intentionally priming technologies which aggregate and amplify the biases of groups of individuals. And if you doubt me on this, you need to read Shoshana Zuboff's recent book, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, which he outlines the experiments that Facebook did back in 2012 and 2014, measuring the priming effects of Facebook and their ability to post messages, colours, themes, and to nudge the political opinions of those. And then they published these in academic papers. So they were working out the power of their engine to shift popular opinion. And of course, over the last few years, we've seen the direct effects of that on the political democracies of the world. And we need to recognise that these intentions of the tech giants in order to run their business models have direct polarising social effects. That in aggregating people with similar biases, they are designed to alienate and exclude those who have different versions of the world than ourselves. So the current tribalism, the current polarisation, is a direct but not exhaustively accounted for phenomenon, but a direct phenomenon related to the function of cognitive priming online. It's also a feature of the amplification of mental health risks, because young people who participate in a world online where they hear their own themes, thoughts and ideas reinforced back to them by others who are similarly inclined are more likely to carry out those behaviours, more likely to iterate those patterns of thinking than if they're exposed to challenging and alternative perspectives on life. And the shocking thing is that we have now reached the point where not only is this a reality, but in fact it's a desired reality for much of the world's population. And what I mean by that is that the internet creates complexity, an overwhelming volume of knowledge and information available to us. And we can't cope with that complexity, and therefore we look for simplicity. And the appeal of a Trump is to make a complex grey world simple. So the strange, confusing desire that has confused Western liberal commentators for the last few years about why developed populations are embracing demagogues and populist leaders is a direct consequence of the need of the human mind for a simpler world and the overwhelming cognitive load of too much complexity. There is a willing surrender to those environments that will prime people to see the world in one way rather than tolerate multiplicities of grey. So don't expect this polarisation and populism to decline. It's going to accelerate. And this is a kind of regression because the 20th century was prized on the ability to handle knowledge equitably, to hold multiple positions, to qualify our positions. And we are rapidly regressing as a population, driven by what are the social affective permeabilities of the human mind. And having taken ourselves onto a digital landscape without any understanding or consideration of how the mind really functions. So what do we need to be educating our young people? What is the first thing we need to be saying to them as educators and head teachers? We need to recognise that the mind is not a straight road engine that will always drive straight, but in fact it is an engine that steers and will bend if the road bends with it. And unless we find ways to teach our children to steer, they will be ill-equipped to navigate the kinds of roads which are being bent by others for them.